Hey guys, how are we today? So just a quick altcoin update. I haven't done one in a little while, but you can clearly see we have seen a really nice rally since I made my last video on the 2nd of September. And it is still a lower high, so we could potentially still see another leg down. However, for the time being, for XRP at least, we are holding the 50 TMA as support. You know, we've had a very long swing that has gone from well below to above it, which has obviously resulted in a correction. But, you know, the daily BX trend is still green. If we have a look at the weekly chart, you can see last week we actually closed a higher low on the weekly BX trender. Now, obviously, this signal on XRP is much less reliable than, you know, Bitcoin and some of the large cap stocks. But, you know, when it works, it works. You get like a 6-7, you know, week breakout, sometimes even longer. So, you know, sometimes you get burnt trying to catch the falling knife, like somewhere through here. Like, you know, you'd have opened long at $2.91, and you would have closed out at $2.14. You'd have gone long again at $2.24, closed out at $2.15, then longed again at $2.37, and so on. But, you know, like here, you go long at $2.20, and, you know, next thing you know, you have a chance to sell at like $3.40. Now, obviously, selling out at $2.76 is still a pretty nice move, but when you get an abnormal move like that, I would personally take some profits. But especially here, like, you would have had to go long at 57 cents, and you know, exiting at $2.30 or potentially taking some profits up at a $3 range. Getting burnt a little bit through here is just part of the game. Now, you can see here we have, whoops, that is on the 1 week 1 bar. If I put that on the 1 week 3 bar, you can see we just don't really have much trend confluence on XRP, which, as Jason and Michael always says, leads to choppy market action, which is exactly what we are seeing right now. You know, up, down, up, down. Now, obviously, if you go down to the 4-hour and 1-hour chart, which I personally don't do for altcoins, there are probably many, many great scalps that are doable, but my eyes are personally on the weekly close this week for XRP, because usually when you see 2 weeks of consecutive higher lows, there's just a lot less false signals than, you know, if you are just looking for 1 week. You just don't get burnt as much. And that's pretty much it for XRP. I'm very much watching this weekly close. Solana, you can see we have had a very nice move up since my last video. And, you know, Michael's been covering this heaps on his YouTube channel. And, you know, he's just been looking at higher lows, higher lows, higher lows. But one thing that is worth noting is we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks up. And if this week takes out $250, we would be 7 weeks up, which, you know, using Gann's 7 to 10 bar rule, usually results in a substantial correction, you know, potentially like 30-ish% or just many, many weeks of sideways price action. You can see here we had 7 weeks up, and it took, you know, 6th of September to 25th of October. It took us 6 weeks to break that top, and we saw a, you know, 40-something% correction for Solana. Now, could that happen? Potentially, you know, like we could potentially retest the breakout of this gigantic bullish pennant right here, come down to $173, or we could potentially retest, you know, the $210 pivot point. But, you know, for as long as price is holding above this yellow trend line here, I don't see any reason to be, you know, calling for crazy price targets like, you know, $170, $140, you know, even a double bottom at $95, because you got to respect support and resistance until it's broken, as Jason and Michael always says. I think that's mostly a Michael quote. But one more thing here is just look at how great the 50 TMA strategy has been holding up, you know. You'd have gone long here at $151. You would have been faked out here, you know, closing out at $158, but you would have been pretty silly to not take some profits up here. Go long again, go short again, go long again, and yeah, so pretty much since $168, you would have been long. So this just goes to show that sometimes, you know, obviously you can jump down to the 4-hour and 1-hour chart and make some great scalps on altcoins. I do that on Bitcoin, but not altcoins myself. Plenty of people are really great at it. I'm not one of them. But, we've seen this huge 8-bar upswing on the daily chart, and obviously that has led us to cool off a bit. But one good thing is we've seen a 7+ bar upswing, but we haven't seen a substantial correction. This is like what, 8-9%, but we are still holding this yellow trend line. Now, that being said, if we do get some volatility with the FOMC meeting, a retest of the old tops around 218, or even this trend line here at 210 is definitely still possible. And that's pretty much it for Solana. Like, trends are up, respect the trend. Ethereum, same thing. The daily 50 TMA strategy, although a lot less reliable on Ethereum, it chops you up quite a bit more, but if you can, mentally weather out those chops and you get in like a ride the short from like 3,400 where you flip long again at like 1,700, get chopped around a little bit here, but Ethereum has been long on the daily 50 TMA strategy since $2,500, and it has been one of the few altcoins along with Solana that has been sitting on top of the 50 TMA through this entire period here where, Bitcoin has where's my Bitcoin daily chart? Where Bitcoin has dropped under the 50 TMA, but, Ethereum, Solana haven't. So as Michael says, the closer to your all-time high or cycle high the crypto is sitting, like the better the position of strength, the more likely it is to get going and do some crazy moves in the next leg up because it just doesn't have as much overhead resistance. And you can clearly see trends are up. Daily, sorry, did not mean to click on that. If we have a look at the weekly chart, Ethereum flipped long on the weekly chart way back here at $1,800, and it's just been long ever since. And there's really not much to talk about, like, until I start seeing some dark red on the weekly BX trender, I will not be looking to exit my ETH position, Obviously, being a weekly signal, it's going to be a bit slower than a daily signal, but just seeing how well we're holding up here, I really don't think Ethereum is going to have any major corrections. You got everyone calling for, $3,000, $3,500, $4,000 corrections, but this could have been it, like, especially in the later stages of the market. Every dip just gets bought up. Later stages of the cycle. DOT. Now, this is one very interesting thing that I was looking at. Now, you can see on DOT, usually when you get a very long swing that goes from below to above the 50 TMA, you usually see a pretty sharp sell-off followed by a parabolic move to continue. Now, if I move that arrow, you can see that was also a 9-bar upswing, which held the market down for, 2-ish weeks. And we did see a pretty substantial sell-off there. That's from 580 to 470. That's 20% sell-off. Now, if we backtest it a bit more, you can see here, again, we saw a 7-bar upswing, but in this case, we only saw a 10% sell-off, and we saw a slow grind up, and then we just popped off. So, in my opinion, DOT is somewhere around here. Now, if we zoom out to the weekly chart, you can see DOT is making lower highs this cycle, but we could potentially see, something like a triple top, and that would still be, nearly a 300% move from where we are here. So, people on X who don't understand anything could be calling for, $100 DOT, $1,000 DOT, like, Jason loves to make fun of them in his YouTube videos, so I'll save the fun for him and not ramble too much myself. But me personally, as a conservative person, I would probably look at taking profits somewhere, between $6 and $11, or when we start seeing, weakness on the daily chart. But for now, it looks like we could very well potentially, after this 10% correction, set up for slow upwards grind action, into October. If you follow Jason's YouTube videos, he says Bitcoin usually doesn't do much between now and October. So even if we do get some big pumps and dumps with the FOMC, or it's very likely we'll see like a slow upwards grinding price action similar to what we saw back here. And that upwards grind, might go up 10-20%, and then we get some huge daily bars to take us into the end of the cycle. So that's my dot analysis. ADA, another very interesting thing, you can clearly see it has mostly respected the daily 50 TMA since breaking out in July. And I do have the swing chart set to 2 bar instead of 1 bar, like I do for all my other altcoins. And pretty much trends are up. Michael does some great analysis for ADA in his YouTube videos, so I won't double up on that if you want to go subscribe to his channel if you aren't already. But you can just see ADA has been a bit of a harder market to trade. Like it does nothing for ages and then does this huge blow off move and then does wild swings up and down, which is really just a bunch of nothingness if you're a long-term trader or investor. But ADA's, I've had long weekly signals since 74 cents, and if we look back here, it would have told you to go long at 33 cents, and for pretty much 2 months it would have been a nothingness, and then you get this huge blow off move. So I think something like that could potentially be brewing again, where the price action does a swing here, swing there, and if you're trading a 1 hour or 4 hour chart on 10x leverage or something like that, you could be making some pretty decent money here. But for me personally, I would just sit in ADA now because daily and weekly strategies for me personally are long, and based on seasonality we could see a blow off move in October, which could potentially be similar to what we saw where is it, like back here in September last year, where your weekly strategy says to long, you're like, you get this 20% move up, maybe you're on leverage and you're making some really good money, and then it comes all the way back down to your entry and you're like hitting yourself like, I'm such an idiot for not selling, and then you get this sudden big move up. Everyone that sold there has to FOMO in at higher and higher prices, or they buy the dip before the dip before the dip. Anyways, no more rambling on my part. Do what you want, maybe you have a exchange, maybe on like Bybit you're trading leverage on these 1 hour, 4 hour daily swings, and maybe on Binance or something like that, where you're just sitting in a spot position and just waiting for this big move. Anyways, speaking of big moves, CRO, we this massive blow off move. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I talked about it in my last video, but you can see we have come down to our old tops, which is and we are holding above it for now. And one more thing is, because this is a 7 bar downswing, it usually represents seller exhaustion, and we are likely to see a substantial reversal. Now, you can see here, when you get 7 bars down after a very big move, you're likely to see at least some sort of reversal. Like that one there was, 25%. So, potentially we get some sort of 25% pump with the FOMC volatility, and, maybe we die off for a bit longer because, usually CRO after a big move like that needs quite a lot of time to digest. However, these moves here were fairly early in the cycle. If I move back to, the previous cycle, same thing, you had big moves up, long periods of consolidation, corrections, big moves up, long periods of consolidations, corrections. But from where we are now in the cycle, I think we're somewhere here where we see, big move up. We might only get, a couple of weeks of consolidation, and our correction might only be like, 30%, which is probably what we've already done, rather than being like, 50, 70% like it's been doing earlier in last cycle and earlier in this cycle. So, it's just people get bored, they sell out, then they FOMO in at higher prices. Because when you look at this, when CRO actually starts going, it goes absolutely parabolic. Like these daily candles here are like 15, 20, percent in a day, and you get very shallow corrections, like, up 50%, down 20% type of corrections. And if I scroll back to where we are now, pardon my terrible mouse work here, you can see from 38 cents to where we are now, that is already, if I can do some quick maths, like a 40% correction. Coupled with, 7 days down, daily BX trender has been red for so long, which usually means we are due for at least a bit of an oversold bounce. Weekly chart, we are making lower highs, but if we go back and look at where I think we are, you might make lower highs and then it quickly reverses. One thing I would be on red alert for is if we see a third week of lower highs, or worse, we start seeing some lower lows, so dark red. That would potentially mean CRO could go dead for, weeks or even months. So personally, in my opinion, invalidation is very close. Your downside potential is what? We've got another resistance cost of like 20 cents, so maybe like 15% down for potentially, hundreds and hundreds of a percent up. So it's a no-brainer for me. BNB, again, you get chopped up a little bit in the grinding action, but, 50 TMA strategy, once it starts going, you're up like 50%. And another really, really bullish thing is we've had a 10 bar upswing, which shows, buying exhaustion. You can't really see it because my chart's on a 2 bar, but this bit here would have been like a 10 bar upswing. Despite that huge buying pressure, we've only seen, like a 4 or 5% correction, and the trends have resumed, like BNB making all-time highs again. One thing to be cautious of, we are 7 weeks up as well. Now you can just see here, on my weekly BX trender strategy, we called along at 650, which was, I think, very similar to where the daily 50 TMA was, and price has just been shooting off since then. Now, one thing that is worth noting is when you see 7 bar upswings, it usually leads to a substantial correction or a, many, many weeks of sideways price action. So I don't think that this is going to be a absolute blow off top and it is over for BNB. But I do think potentially BNB might need to cool off a little bit. If we get, 6 weeks of sideways action, like, where seasonality suggests in Jason's videos, it's quiet September, sideways, big October pump, mid-October. But one thing that is a bit of a cause for concern for me is when we saw these big 7-8 bar upswings, and then we saw very minor corrections followed by big rallies, BNB was trading around the 50-week triangular moving average. But right now we are so overextended. But, if the cycle does end in the next, month or two, and we only see another few weeks, we could see, 2 or 3 weeks correction, which would reset this swing count. And then we could see another, 6-7 week upswing, which takes us into the end of the cycle, because we're like 1,020 days into this cycle, and cycles usually run for around 1,070 or so. But yeah, you can clearly see like towards towards the end of the cycle, you can get like a 7-8 bar upswing followed by here, you can get like a 9 bar upswing, followed by another 7 bar upswing after just, what was that? Like a 3-4 week correction, which would line up with seasonality. Now, obviously, I don't expect us to have this much volatility because, BNB's got a much, much bigger market cap than it did back then. And I doubt, people would let it sell off that much. SUI has been an absolute pain to trade. Well, invest. It's been pretty nice to trade on a 1 hour and 4 hour strategy. If that's what you're doing. Daily 50 TMA says to long. Weekly BX trender. We did close last week higher low. which is technically a long signal. However, this week isn't looking great so far, but it's only Wednesday and we've got FOMC coming up very soon. So we could see some, upside volatility, which would confirm a uptrend. Really not much for me to say on SUI. I would just say, follow the strategy. My daily and weekly strategies say to long right now, but I am watching for invalidation and expecting volatility. SAI, same thing. You get a big upswing that takes you through above the 50 TMA, and that usually results in a bit of a correction to test the 50 TMA. Now, one thing that is worth noting right now is it looks like we're on track to get 3 daily closes at the same level, coupled with holding above the daily 50 TMA and these long wicks to the downside. It could suggest a reversal because, Michael says Gann rule. Michael teaches this Gann rule. What English am I saying? God. 3 closes at the same level usually leads to a reversal. Again, if we backtest SAI, if you get a long swing from below to above the 50 TMA, and you'll usually see some sort of correction, but the uptrend usually resumes pretty soon after. Now, if I pull back here, big upswing, long consolidation, but usually you get another impulsive move up. So if you're entering now on a 50x leverage, and you think prices are going to immediately skyrocket, they might for a little bit, but I doubt you'd be able to hold that all the way through to, a 50, 70, 100% move. So, but getting in on, spot or, low leverage long, we do have our weekly signal. We had a sell here, buy here. And this week so far is looking like a hold, unless we get dark red, I am still going to hold SAI. Over to Rune. Rune has been a pain in the ass. I've had a lot of success trading it using the 4-hour 2-bar mixed mechanical method strategy that is taught over in TIA Premium. And I talk with the community there a lot about that. It's made me so much money on longs and shorts just because it does sometimes up to 19 bars in one swing on the 4-hour 2-bar strategy. So, you get chopped in and out a little bit, but for every loss, you make a win that's 3, 4, 5 times as big. Anyway, Rune is looking like it is in a weak position because we've had a long swing that has gotten us above the 50 TMA on the daily, but we have not been able to hold above it. Whilst, a lot of the stronger altcoins that I've shown you earlier have managed to hold above it. And also, we are still down on the 2-bar and 3-bar, and we're down on the weekly. Now, Rune has, we have technically had a long signal up here, 139, and we did get a nice pop-up, so if you entered somewhere here, sold here, congrats. But if you are waiting for a move that looks something like that, maybe you just have to keep waiting. We've got the 50-week TMA up here around $2. And if we keep chopping sideways, it's going to come down a bit, maybe $1.50, $1.70. And that usually serves as some pretty, decent resistance, as you can see here. Took us, 3 attempts to break above it. So who knows, maybe, based on seasonality, we have another 6 weeks sideways where we attempt 1, 2, 3 breakouts, eventually break out, and we hit this trend line up here. That's still a 300% move into another lower high, just like DOT. I don't think we're going to be taking out cycle highs, all-time highs, but if you do follow this strategy, you have your invalidations in place, you could still make, a 3x trade on something like that. And at the end of the day, we're here to make money, not marry the altcoin, I stole that quote off, Jason, not my own. Bonk here, same thing, the deal. Long swing above the 50 TMA, backtest it, holding it as support, pretty good. Could potentially see something like this, long swing, backtest, consolidate, big run up. I'm not going to backtest it anymore. You get the gist. Bonk is looking pretty strong on the daily time frame. Weekly chart. We got our higher low on the weekly BX trender. This week is looking good so far, you know. And if you didn't get in last week, price is pretty much exactly where it was. And we don't have a lot of data because obviously Bonk hasn't been around for that many weeks. But, you know, usually when you see a higher low close, you see a pretty good run. You know, sometimes you might get chopped up, but I would take an L somewhere through here and here any day to get a W that looks like that. Like, you know, like I would, like, you know, I buy at 21 cents, sell at 16 cents, eat a 20% loss, buy in at 17 cents, and, you know, ride it all the way to 60 cents. And close out on any remaining position at, you know, 31 cents. So you know, I make between 2 to 4x on that trade whilst I only lose 20%. So will Bonk do something like that? You know, like even through here, we had some pretty nice, you know, 150% moves on Bonk. So potentially we see something like that again. Unfortunately, Bonk does look like it is making lower highs. So, you know, even a move up to, you know, 32 cents, where we've had some previous support and resistances, would still be a 30% move if my maths is right. So for now, I'm holding long on Bonk. Obviously expect volatility with FOMC, but follow the strategy. Render, you know the deal. Long swing above 50 TMA, backtest it, holding it as support, very nice. If we do a little bit of quick backtesting on Render, if my internet will cooperate with me, oh yeah, because I had the token rename thing, so I'm not gonna go pull up any old charts because I've done that with enough other altcoins, but you can just see with Render, it isn't looking too great. But, you know, weekly strategy says to long on last week's close, price is pretty much where it is now, and I guess if you do want to go long on Render, strategy says to long, and we can potentially hope for, you know, some nice moves potentially. Unfortunately, we are making lower highs, so by nice move, it could very well just be a 3-4% move. Not holding high hopes. Pepe. We had this huge move up above the 50 TMA. We've backtested it, held it as support, which, you know, we've done many times in the past, which has usually led to another leg up. Internet, hello. You can see here, you know, we get big swings. Yeah. See, we get big swings up from below to above the 50 TMA. We consolidate for a bit or a very long bit, and we usually see at least another leg up. So this isn't a 7+ bar swing, but same analogy. You get a big move up, you know, long consolidation. This timing actually times up very well, you know, September to November chop and then a big blow off move. But here's the thing with meme coins, like if you don't want to hold it through the chop and the market really starts taking off, you know, and you get back in, you could very well be buying the top, because when the market really takes off, it really doesn't give you many pullbacks. It just goes straight up, but that's just a meme coin thing. So for me, I'm long on Pepe, and I'm going to ignore any noise. And you can clearly see here on the weekly strategy, which just from a glance, you can see, you know, you'll get chopped up a little bit through here, but, you know, when it really starts going, you might take, you know, a 20% L here and there, but you get this massive, you know, nearly 300% W. Same here, you know, 6 cents to 15 cents, you get like a 250% win. And you might get chopped up a little bit here, but then you get this really nice run here. So potentially, Pepe might be setting up for another nice run. Now, these lower highs aren't very inspiring, but, you know, we get higher highs, lower highs, and another higher high. Could potentially be what we're seeing now, a couple of lower highs, and then we see another higher high to 36 cents or something like that. I would have to do a separate video where I do some more trend lines, put up a few more indicators, do a deeper dive on Pepe, because I am very interested. Now you can see here we've rejected off the 50% level, but using this weekly strategy, you can actually get in at a better price than what the signal would have actually fired at. So Pepe is definitely one of my stronger contenders right now. Pendle right here, you can see on the weekly time frame, is looking a lot stronger than some of the other altcoins I've covered. Now, obviously, it's not as strong as like Sol or ETH, because if you come down to the daily time frame, it is losing the 50 TMA, which it doesn't seem to respect as much as, say, some of the other altcoins, because you do get like a fake out to the downside and the uptrend continues a bit more frequently in my experiences. But you can't discount the fact that the Gann swing indicator is down on the 2-bar and 3-bar timeframes. And the weekly chart is having a dark red week so far. Obviously, with the volatility announcement coming up, we could easily see a snap reversal. Now, one more thing to note is, like BNB, Pendle has been in a steady uptrend since March, just pretty much higher lows. So you would be getting in quite late on the move if you were looking at it from a weekly perspective. But coming down to the daily, I guess, once you get the confirmation that we close back above the 50 TMA, you could get back in, even if it's for, a short move that's just 2 or 3 weeks. If you're in it to, make 20, 25% and you have like a 5x leverage or something, then good for you. We'll do a quick look at OKB before I wrap up for today. And if we zoom out to the weekly time frame, you can see OKB is actually consolidating the move very well. And you can see, we are down about 20-ish% from the highs, where at most we were down, can I maths, like 30 and a bit percent, compared to CRO, where, we've retraced, can I maths? Is that 30%, 40 something percent? Yeah. So OKB is holding up better than CRO. Sorry that you had to watch my abysmal maths there. But another thing to note is CRO, it looks like, for now, we are getting 2 weeks of lower highs, whilst OKB is only in its first week of lower highs. So there's 2 ways to look at it. Like, it could be that we're just going to chop sideways before the next leg up, or we're going to chop sideways, everyone thinks we're consolidating, and then it's just going to dump. Like, when you see abnormal moves like that, that's nearly a 5x move in 2 weeks. You kind of do have to think that the market is going to need to digest that move for a bit longer than something like CRO, where we saw a 130% move in a week and a 300% move in 7 weeks. And OKB's move looks really similar to this end of cycle CRO move, where we did, 18 cents to just under $1, like 450% in, 4 weeks basically. So I do personally believe OKB could have printed a cycle top. And if we do manage to not break down from, $160 and we keep making higher lows and lower highs, and this becomes like a bullish pennant, we could potentially rally into either a lower top, which could still be a 15, 20, 25% move from here, or we rally into a slightly higher top. We've got 400% extensions here at 287 and, $300 psychological level. But for me personally, I can't bring myself to trade OKB. It doesn't look right. But anyways, it's your money, your choice. Do what you want. I don't really have many opinions on OKB, except that, that vertical move, if I put CRO over on a monthly chart, it looks very, very similar to the end of cycle CRO move. Like, it just looks like a bit of a blow-off move to me. Now, obviously, this month has not closed, and if you have a look at last cycle, for CRO, this bar here did make an attempt higher above the high of the previous bar, but it closed lower. So you can see right now we are above where the previous bar closed, but if this month closes under $175, I would be on red alert for OKB, and I would potentially be looking at being a hero and shorting the top. Who knows? Thank you all for watching, and please like, comment, and subscribe. Goodbye.